Hello, yes, we're here for the Waltham Land Trust What About Chestnuts Zoom presentation with Dr. Sandy. Next, my name is Sonia Wadman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Waltham Land Trust. Our mission is to promote, protect, restore, and acquire open space. I know that a lot of you are quite familiar with the Land Trust and what we do, but I think that there might be some people who aren't as familiar, so we're just going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Land Trust. So we are very similar to a friends love our open spaces, and we want people to love them just like we do. So we have lots of events usually in the month. We usually have a couple of walks or hikes, and we always have a fundraiser. Unfortunately, with the weather being as it is in February in New England, and especially brutal, it seems, this February, we have been staying inside. We've had to postpone our walks or reconsider them for a while. So a couple of our groups and people have been thinking about what type of Zoom presentations would be interesting. We've seen a lot of our colleagues at the Newton Conservators and other places have been having some great Zoom programs. So we thought, what about us having a Zoom program? So part of the way that the Land Trust is like your friends group is that we have a lot of volunteers who help us with our work. And some of our best volunteers are our stewards. These are volunteers who are out on the trail, picking up litter, removing invasives, maybe not so much when it's snowing out, but they are active throughout the year. And they suggested, or there was talk on the list about chestnut trees. People wanted to learn more about chestnut trees. So one of our awesome stewards, Betty McKenzie, who's going to talk a little bit later, said she knew someone who could tell us all about chestnut trees. So we so chestnut trees. So there's a few more words about the Land Trust. Next slide, please. Thanks. So we are a membership group. This means that the majority of our funding comes from people like you who pay us dues just once a year, and they're quite reasonable, I think. It's only $25 for an individual or $50 for a household. And the dues help us pay not only for our awesome Zoom presenters, but also for the tools and the trainings that our volunteer stewards need. Our land conservation campaigns sometimes require us to spend some funds. We have trail guides, which are on our website, walthamlandtrust.org, but we print a whole bunch of them to have in brochure holders along the Western Greenway Trail in the Chesterbrook Woods and Middlesex County Hospital lands area. So our trail guides, as you might imagine, are going like hotcakes. So we've got to reprint those constantly. And the dues also help to pay for staff and for our office space and other stuff. Our members also get our biannual newsletter every spring and fall. And this spring, we are going to be talking about our new board directors, because we have 5 of them. And we're also going to talk about our the Waltham Field Station, because this is the 100th year of Cornelia Warren donating that land and other wonderful land. So we're going to get into details about the field station, about our new board members and other cool stuff in our newsletter. Members also get discounts on our ticketed events. So you would feel great about knowing you're part of the cause by being a member, and you get all these other cool benefits too. So please join us at walthamlandtrust.org. And if we were here in person, I would say you could also just make a donation, and I would bust out Hootie the donation owl, who is watching and participating here right now. So Hootie says, don't forget, you can always make a donation too, and you can do this at walthamlandtrust.org. Our upcoming events. So we like to have a duck walk along the Charles. We do it every year. And we're trying to do it this weekend. We've been putting it off, but we're going to try to get in this weekend. So watch our website and watch for the e-blasts. If you don't get my e-blasts, those which say what our events are and news, sign up to get my e-blasts at walthamlandtrust.org. Space is going to be very limited on this. Registration will be required. So watch the website and watch for the e-blasts. Then 1 week from tonight is a fundraiser at John Brewer's Tavern. This is located at 39 Main Street, very near the Watertown line. So if you go in person, because they are open for in-person dining, or if you want to get takeout, that's fine. You just have to call them up and then go pick up your order. So if you're in person or if you're going and picking up your order that you placed by phone, you give them a certificate, which you can get from our website, walthamlandtrust.org, and we will get 20% of your food and drink sale. So that's the 1 week from tonight, guys. So I want everyone to go to Brewers or to plan on ordering by phone takeout, and we will get some money, and we thank you very much for it. We're going to have another fundraiser later on in March at Bertrucci's. That is going to be on March 25th. And same deal, dine in and takeout. And actually, they have delivery. They have a whole bunch of options. And I just learned that one can go to any Bertrucci's, and you're going to be giving them a certificate, and then we'll get a percentage of your sale. It's 15%, but you can go to any Bertrucci's. So I realize that probably most of us are going to go to Waltham, but if you happen to be closer to one somewhere else, you can go there too. There's a code that needs to be shared. So we'll have that information on our website soon. And then some of our upcoming Zoom programs, which I know are going to be of interest to you all. So might as well put these on your calendar. Tuesday, March 30th, we will be having Owls Native to the Western Greenway. That Zoom program is going to be at 7 p.m. on March 30th. And Barbara, a woman named Barbara, is going to be presenting from Mass Audubon. And then the next week, Tuesday, April 6th, we will be having a program about insects and how they are affected by climate change. And that too will be at 7 p.m. So put those on your calendar, and we look forward to sending out information about that. And then you'll sign up for those just like you did for this, and it'll be great. So now I am very much looking forward to introducing Betty McKenzie. She is going to explain how the program is going to work here and then introduce our speaker. Betty.
Well, hi, folks. What a great activity, an indoor activity for February. It's really fun to be doing this. In regards to technical issues and how we're going to structure things, Sandy will be doing a presentation and talking for a while. And then at the end, she will be fielding questions that Barbara will be sending and that we would like to see from you in the question and answer. And we see that Russ Cohen has already started. So that's perfect. If you have questions, and Sandy may certainly answer them in her presentation, but if you have questions, please put them in the question and answer. If you are having technical problems of some sort, please put that into the chat, and we have someone, one of the magic people offline who is handling those kinds of issues. Diana Young, thanks very much. So I think otherwise, now we're going to talk chestnuts. So we are, wow, this is just so exciting. That's what's going on here. I back in the early 1980s, opened a direct mailing from the American Chestnut Foundation. You know, a direct mail, you never open these, right? But I opened it, and sure enough, they started talking about chestnuts and how to bring them back and what had happened. And this was from the American Chestnut Foundation. I was hooked. I helped support the cause. I began getting updates and news and reading articles of somebody named Dr. Sandra Anagnostakis. So then here I am later in Waltham, and I'm living near Gravesend Park. And I go to a meeting at the Arnold Arboretum in 2018 about chestnuts and bringing them back. And who do I meet but Sandy? And she lives a few doors away on the other side of Gravesend. It was unbelievable. So since that time, she's become an active member of the Land Trust and the Hardy Pond Association, and a resource for us with her great knowledge about trees and biology and et cetera, and just really always jumping in on that kind of thing. So it is truly a pleasure for me to introduce Sandy, Dr. Sandra Anagnostakis. But we call her Dr. Sandy. So Dr. Sandy started working on genetics and pathology of the chestnut blight in 1968. And with Richard Janes, she began testing biological controls for the blight that hit the American chestnut. When Janes retired, she took on the tree breeding and added to the species of chestnuts, Castanea, planted at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station in New Haven, including its orchard at Lockwood Farm. Since retiring, Sandy is not sitting around the house only reading books or helping the land trust. Dr. Sandy has continued making crosses for improved orchard and timber chestnuts and working with plant nurseries interested in propagating and selling chestnut trees to the public. She is the official keeper of the Chestnut Cultivar Registry, and she'll tell us all about cultivars and species, etc. I am delighted that Sandy is now part of our community, supporting open space efforts in Waltham, and that she is sharing her vast experience and knowledge with us this evening. She will give you other avenues to ask questions and get information after tonight's Zoom meeting. So thank you. Here we go. Thank you, Sandy.
Okay, here we go. So what about chestnuts? This is something that lots of people feel very strongly about. And I'm happy to tell you what I know about American chestnuts. And here we go. It's not, please, yes. Here's my favorite picture of an American chestnut. This is Castanea dentata. It was a photograph taken in 1905 in Connecticut. It was part of a logging operation. So when they cut this tree down, they counted the rings and they found out that it was 103 years old. It was 83 feet tall and 27 inches in diameter. And you can see a little person standing down there at the bottom, right down here. Gives you some idea of the size of this tree. Here's an American chestnut leaf. The leaves are deeply indented along the edges. They are single and alternate on the stem. They're not at all fuzzy, either the leaf or the stem. That's one of the ways of recognizing an American chestnut. Now, there are lots of chestnuts all around the world in the temperate zone. There's one species in Europe, one species in Japan, at least 3 species in China, and 5 species that we have figured out so far in the United States. These are all Castanea. The trees that we call chestnuts have 3 nuts in each burr, and the trees that we call chinkapins have 1 nut in each burr. But all of these species can cross with each other, which is not what you learned in biology. You learned that different species couldn't cross with each other, but all of the Castanea are able to cross with each other, which makes them a really interesting group to be working with. One of the reasons that American chestnuts were so valuable was that they sprout from the base, from a bunch of dormant embryos that are around the root collar. So once the trees are harvested, they will sprout and grow back. And here you see sprouts that are 50 years old after a timber harvest. You can see why they were so useful for telephone poles and railroad ties. And in addition to their shape and their straightness of grain, the wood is very resistant to rotting. So it was highly preferred for those uses. But in addition to that, the milled lumber, the milled board feet, had lots of uses. Now this is from 1910 in Connecticut, and you can see that half of the lumber, milled board feet of chestnut in Connecticut in 1910 went into musical instruments. And because I'm sure you'll be as curious about that as I was, I found out that the town of Ivoryton, Connecticut, is where pianos were made. And the ivory could come up the river up to Ivoryton, as well as the lumber, the ivory to make the keys, and the chestnut lumber and other kinds of woods to produce the body of the piano. Lots of other products were made from the chestnut lumber. You can see it here. And it was generally assumed that it would always be around. Now, this is a really interesting slide showing the pre-settlement amount of chestnut in New England. It was a study by Cogbill, and you can see that most of the chestnut was concentrated a little further south of Massachusetts. But in Massachusetts, the largest amount was kind of in the middle of the state, with very little in the eastern part of the state. Then I love this picture from the Harvard Forest. It's David Foster and the people at the Harvard Forest looked at tree abundance in Massachusetts between 1620 and 1801. And you can see that in eastern Massachusetts, all the way over to central Massachusetts, there was a lot of oak. In western Massachusetts, there was beech. Other species were checked as well. But again, the chestnut that was in the forest is mostly in the middle of the state. Now, this was a study of the surveys up to 1801. Starting around 1800, the people who had settled in the United States decided that they really wanted to have the kinds of chestnuts that they were used to having in Europe. The European chestnuts are much larger than American chestnuts. American chestnuts are pretty small. And the people who wanted the chestnuts for eating wanted to be able to grow European chestnuts. They started importing them in the late 1700s. And the earliest records that we have for sure are that Thomas Jefferson was planting them in 1773. And there were lots and lots of European chestnuts planted, mostly in places where people had money to buy the trees, of course. But those were providing orchard trees for people to collect the nuts. Now, it's important to understand the difference between a timber tree and an orchard tree. A timber tree is for growing in the forest. It grows straight and tall and doesn't stop growing until it reaches the canopy. So when it gets up to the top where the leaves are in full sun, then those leaves which are in full sun will start producing chestnuts. And usually that doesn't happen for several years because the tree's putting all of its energy into vertical growth. An orchard tree, like the European chestnuts that were imported, stays short and spreading. It produces very large nuts and produces them early in the life of the tree. So there are two very different kinds of chestnut trees. The orchard trees have been selected for that particular growth form for many, many years. Here are a couple of the orchard trees that were popular in the 1800s. Paragon, which was a European by American cross, was planted extensively all up and down the East Coast, was shipped all over the country by boxcar load, and many people were growing it because the nuts were very large and very tasty. Then we had Boone, which was a Japanese by American hybrid, another popular cultivar. When I say cultivar, I'm talking about a clone, and these clones are, the name is always enclosed in single quotes. That's how you know people are talking about a cloned tree. It's identical to the original. So many of these orchard trees were planted. There was a good orchard industry. In the early 1900s, there were three of the orchards alone in Pennsylvania and New Jersey had 570 acres that were planted with 105,000 European and hybrid trees. So the orchard industry was doing very well and selling nuts all over the country. Unfortunately, both the timber trees and the orchard trees came to a grinding halt because of two imported organisms. The first was one that came into the southern United States, probably before 1824. And we think it may have come in on cork oak trees that came from Portugal. Now, this organism used to be called a water mold, but it's not a fungus. It infects the trees at the base. It kills the roots and grows up into the stem, totally killing the trees. In the southern United States, where it was first found, it killed all of the chestnuts and chinkapins in the whole area. Then the second disaster, which is something that more people know about, is chestnut blight disease. This came in on Japanese chestnuts that were imported. The first ones were imported in 1876. And by 1904, this fungus had spread every place where people had planted these Japanese chestnuts. The fungus gets into a broken branch or a wound on the tree, and it grows in and underneath the bark, killing the cambium, which is the living part of the tree. And once it has grown all the way around the tree or the stem, and the cambium is killed, then the tree dies. And the reason this happens is that chestnuts are ring porous trees. Ring porous trees have new vessels being produced every spring by the cambium on the inside, and new bark being produced on the outside by the cambium. If the cambium's killed, no new vessels can be produced. But a ring porous tree blocks up all of the old vessels in the middle of the tree, essentially by the end of the year. So there's no vessels available to transport water up, water and minerals up, and nutrients down from the top. And if new vessels are not formed, nothing can be transported and the tree will die. This is very different, of course, from a diffuse porous tree like a maple. The vessels, the old vessels in the middle of the maple are very slowly blocked up. Most of them still work. So if the cambium is killed, if you girdle a maple tree, it will probably sit there for several years before it knows it's dead. You can't kill diffuse porous trees easily by girdling, but a ring porous tree like chestnut is killed usually within one season. So there we were. We had timber trees being killed and orchard trees being killed. The orchard industry pretty much crashed because there were no good substitutes. In the forest, here's my old friend tree number 5 in Rocky Hill, where I worked for a number of years. You can see that tree number 5 has made a lot of sprouts from the base. And in places where there are timber Americans, they still survive because they keep sprouting from the base. And this, of course, gives us hope that if we could find some way of curing the blight or somehow getting those trees to grow without dying of blight, we could get timber trees back again. And the reason we care about chestnuts as a timber tree in the forest is because the diversity of the forest is extremely important. If you have a planting that's all one kind of plant, all one kind of tree, and a new disease or insect comes in and kills that one kind of tree, you've lost the whole planting. If you have a very diverse forest, a new disease or insect comes in, it's going to take longer for those diseases or insects to move from the susceptible host to another one in that diverse forest. We're losing so many trees now, not only because of diseases and insects, but because of the deer pressure in the woods. Oak trees are not regenerating as they once did because of deer pressure. So it's very important that we encourage diversity in our forests. Of course, one of the first things that people realized was that Asian chestnut trees, many of the Asian chestnut trees, were resistant to both of these diseases. And a lot of Asian chestnut trees were planted in the forests, and people very quickly realized that they simply weren't tall enough to compete. The forests in Connecticut and Massachusetts were 80 feet tall. And if the trees got to 60 feet, it wasn't good enough. I'm told by my friend, a nurseryman in Vermont, that the forests up there are more like 60 feet. So maybe they would have a better chance. But knowing that Asian trees were resistant, the obvious solution was to crossbreed Asian chestnut trees with Americans and try and get resistant trees that would grow in the forest. Here's a short list of people who started doing breeding for timber trees. The USDA had a program that started in 1924. They planted a lot of hybrids and Asian trees in wooded areas, but the program was stopped in 1955. The experiment station in Connecticut started making crosses for both timber and orchard trees in 1930, and that program is still going. University of Tennessee had a program from 1970 to 1980, and they helped us in Connecticut by supplying some of our trees. The American Chestnut Cooperators is a group based in Virginia. They have gone around and collected cuttings from surviving American chestnuts on the assumption that if they've survived when everything else around them died, they must have a little more resistance. So they have grafted these cuttings in orchards all together to allow them to cross with each other. And they're continuing that program. Then the American Chestnut Foundation started about the same time, and they based their breeding program on Chinese and American trees, made crosses, and continued to select for timber trees that would keep growing tall and straight. And now they are supporting a program at SUNY Syracuse where a gene which will keep the blight fungus from killing trees has been inserted into American chestnuts. We've had those trees checked and they were pure American chestnuts. As soon as these trees get through the regulations, the federal regulations, and are released, we'll be able to plant those American chestnuts in the forest and try and get them back, regenerating a little diversity. Now we've got all these hybrid trees, the stuff that we've produced in Connecticut, the things the American Chestnut Foundation have produced. What do we do if we want to plant them? Well, it really would be pretty silly to try and plant them in a forest. This is a pretty typical forest as they exist these days. There's lots of underbrush. There's very little chance of anything surviving in a situation like that. When I did most of my plantings, I waited until there was a timber harvest and everything was cut down. Then I went in and planted my hybrid trees with tree shelters to protect them from deer and had pretty good survival. But there's another technique that I've used that's also possible. This relies on a wonderful machine called a brush hog. And here is the brush hog and its operator. Hired this guy to come and drive his brush hog around, and it munched up all of the underbrush in this area so that there were places where there was some open space where there was good light coming down and trees could be planted. So that's another possibility for planting in the forest. So we planted all these trees. I've planted a lot. My predecessors planted some. How will we know they're successful? Unfortunately, it takes a long time for a chestnut tree to grow. If we plant it today, it may be 40 or so years before we know whether it's going to compete in the forest with all of the other trees and all of the things growing underneath the trees and actually reach the canopy, because that's the crucial thing. So will some of our hybrids be successful forest trees? I really hope so. And I'm looking forward to finding that out. People have asked where they can see chestnuts near Waltham. One of the first things I saw when I moved to Waltham was a really fine little Japanese chestnut. It's at the corner of Route 20 and Cedarwood Avenue. And it's right behind the bus shelter there. I recommend that you drive down Cedarwood and park and go look at the Japanese chestnut. I've driven around the neighborhood and I couldn't find any more chestnuts there. Well, that's unfortunate because it means that that little tree will not be producing any nuts, because you have to have two different chestnuts in order for the nuts to form. It takes two to tango. So that poor little Japanese chestnut will not have any viable nuts unless somebody plants another one near it. As for a really good collection of chestnut trees, you can see the chestnuts at the Arnold Arboretum. They have trees that are many species of Castanea. They have the ones we call chinkapins and the ones we call chestnuts. and that's on Arbor Way in Boston. Usually you can park along the street. And that's a picture of me with one of their chinkapins, one of their Ozark chinkapins. Those are actually pretty good timber trees. And in the Ozarks, they compete just fine unless they get chestnut blight. But they are a little more resistant than American chestnuts. All right. Now, I have a lot of information on my webpage. If you want information on how to grow chestnuts, there's that. There's a very thorough article with lists of importations, chestnuts that were brought into the United States at various times, and descriptions of what they were. I also have just recently added J.M. Nave's list of where you can buy chestnuts, either the nuts themselves or the trees, and many other things. There are some pictures. I have pictures listed as species of chestnut. So you can look at the various stages of chestnut, the different species, and the pictures will help you with identification. And there's also a key there. Now, I've been very lucky since I've retired and come up here to Waltham, that a nurseryman in Vermont has taken on this mission of making sure that the important cultivars, the nut cultivars, and some of the timber types are being not only preserved, but made available to people who want to buy them. So he is at Perfect Circle Farm in Vermont. If you want to plant a couple of chestnut trees, I would not suggest planting them near your house because the flowers smell absolutely awful. But if you have some land and want to plant a few chestnuts for nuts, you can get some very nice ones from Perfect Circle Farm. There are other people on Nave's list in the Northeast selling chestnuts, seedlings for the most part. And it's possible to grow a few chestnuts because the cultivars that have been selected for nuts are resistant to diseases, of course. Because of that, the orchard industries are starting to come back again. And eventually you'll be able to see chestnuts in your market. And they'll be in much better shape than the pretty awful things that you find now, which come from Europe. I've put my email address there as well. If there's something you don't see on the website or a question you don't get answered now, tonight, you can send me an email and I'll answer. Okay, let's see, whoever is going to work with Q&A.
That's me.
Let's have a few questions.
Okay, I have a question here. I have heard varying reports about whether or not chestnut trees have mast years. Do they? And if they do, what factors affect which trees have big fruiting, i.e. nutting years or not? And is there any difference in mast year frequency among the various species?
I have seen no evidence of this. The major difference is whether there's going to be enough water at the end of the summer for the nuts to actually form. The other thing which affects mast years, of course, for most trees, is whether or not there's a freeze in the late spring when the flowers are blooming. And that's something that keeps oaks from producing a whole lot of acorns every year because the flowers are frequently frozen. Chestnuts, however, don't flower until quite late. And usually I'm out there in the orchard on 4th of July weekend, making pollinations and making crosses. So in late June, early July, chestnuts make their flowers and cross. And because of that, very rarely is there a serious disruption in nut production. And we have pretty good records of orchards in various places that seem fairly constant year to year.
Okay, another question. This person, Russ, found that chestnuts, he found Chinese, he thinks, chestnuts this fall that had produced lots of nuts. Unfortunately, he got them home and discovered that at least a third of them were infected with weevils. Do all chestnut species have similar vulnerability to weevil damage?
Yes, unfortunately, weevils are one of the banes of the commercial orchardist. What I always have done, and which works quite well, is to collect the nuts promptly and parboil them. You bring a big pot of water to a rolling boil, drop in the nuts. When the rolling boil starts again, you scoop them out, dry them off, and put them in the freezer, and then you can use them any way you want to for the rest of the year. Now, people who have commercial orchards and are selling nuts have elaborate systems of heating the nuts to 120 degrees for exactly 20 minutes with stirring. And that kills the eggs before they hatch into the weevil larvae. If nothing is done, I am pretty sure the general system is that the nut falls from the tree, the eggs hatch, the larvae develop, they crawl around and eat the contents of the nut. They eat their way out and go down into the soil and overwinter there, and then come out the following spring as a weevil, where they're able to lay their eggs in the developing nuts.
Okay. So if
Barbara, excuse me.
yeah.
We're still having people ask questions in the chat, so we make sure we answer them. Could you please put your question in the Q&A? We don't want to miss your question. So thank you.
Thanks. All right. Is it true that chestnut trees hybridize? And I believe you answered it, but if blooming chestnuts of different species are near each other, could they crossbreed with each other? Then the nut produced from these trees could be a mixture of two species. Is that right?
That's right. That assumes that the flowers are blooming at the same time. But chestnuts have a fairly long bloom time. So the pollen, they're wind pollinated. So the wind blowing the pollen around will certainly cross-pollinize trees that are close enough together. And all of the species will cross with each other.
Okay. Russ also puts in that there were several large non-American Castanea trees in North Concord along Lindsay Pond Road. And he has a website that will be, we'll probably have that somewhere on the Land Trust website. So I'm gonna hold that. What kind of chestnuts what kind of chestnut tree produces the nut we buy in the market and eat roasted?
The ones that are usually available in the market are European chestnut. Unfortunately, it's very hard to convince people in grocery stores that chestnuts are not like regular nuts. You can't just put them out dry on the counter, because if they're dry at room temperature, they will be moldy and useless within about a week. Chestnuts have to be refrigerated. I always tell people, the grocery store people, that they should treat them like tomatoes. They should put them on a counter where it's not so dry and where it is refrigerated, and then the chestnuts will last longer. So if you see European chestnuts coming into the market, if you buy them right away, probably some of them will be pretty good. But your best bet is to buy domestic chestnuts, which you can get by mail order. And your chances of getting good quality nuts are much better.
Okay, and I did put in the chat that last comment of where you can find the chestnut tree in Concord and around Lindsay Pond Road, so you can look for that. Are true nuts edible from all species in cultivar? This might be a good time to talk about the horse chestnuts we had talked about earlier.
Okay, some people occasionally say to me, are horse chestnuts edible? Well, no, they're not. I'm told they're poisonous, but that they're so bitter that nobody would actually eat them. Horse chestnuts are in a completely different family. So they're not related to chestnuts at all. Horse chestnuts have a palmate leaf. That means there's 5 segments to the leaf, and that leaf, the 5 segments are attached by the petiole to the stem. True chestnuts have simple leaves, single leaves that are alternate on the stem. Horse chestnut leaves are opposite on the stem. And there's always somebody who brings up Longfellow and says, oh, the spreading chestnut. And the newspaper people love to use that phrase. Now, unfortunately, Longfellow's spreading chestnut was a horse chestnut, which is in the genus Aesculus, not a chestnut at all. We know that his tree was a horse chestnut because when the tree died, the people in town cut it down and made some lumber out of it, and they made him a chair. And on the back of the chair, they carved a picture of the horse chestnut leaf. And there were doubters, of course. People didn't believe that. So a sample of the wood from the bottom of one of the legs was sent to the wood products lab in Wisconsin, and they identified it positively as a horse chestnut. But all of the species of Castanea have edible nuts. Some of them taste better than others. They have very different characteristics and flavors, and you cook them differently. European chestnuts, you can roast quickly over a hot fire once you've made a cut in the nuts so they don't explode. But quick hot cooking works well for them. Chinese chestnuts should be cooked slowly at a lower temperature and are usually boiled. And so there are differences in how you would prepare them, but they're all edible.
Is there any other host for the fungus blight, or is it only chestnuts?
Yes, the fungus is also able to infect several species of oak tree, but there are none that are killed by the fungus. If you see, let's see, scarlet oak. If you see a scarlet oak that's very abruptly spreading at the base and looks quite swollen, that's usually chestnut blight. And one of the reasons the fungus has stayed around so long is that there's always something around, either the debris on the forest floor or some kinds of oaks that will serve as a place for the fungus to grow.
Okay. You say heating kills weevils inside chestnuts. Is that why chestnuts came to be roasted, or is that only about the flavor?
For European chestnuts, it's mostly about the flavor. I personally don't much like European chestnuts. They're kind of like potatoes, but their flavor is certainly improved by roasting.
Is it possible to graft one Chinese chestnut tree with another variety of chestnuts so they will produce nuts?
It is possible. In fact, grafting is how you propagate the things that are called cultivars, the clones, because you can't root cuttings of chestnut. The only way to propagate them, to get clones of chestnut, is to graft them. And some people are pretty good at it. The people at Perfect Circle Farm have remarkable ability to graft chestnuts. I was never very good at it myself, but you can graft a tree, and one of the ways of having a single tree and still getting nuts is to graft a branch from a different tree onto one that's growing. Then you have essentially two separate trees growing together, and the pollen from one will go to the other and from the other to the one, and you'll get nuts formed.
Okay. Are American chestnuts the food of any Native American animal species? Did their population crash with the loss of the species?
Well, there has been lots of effort to try and find this out for sure. I've heard a great story. I don't know if it's true, but I have heard it said that passenger pigeons used to migrate from north to south in the fall when the chestnuts were ripe. And so as they migrated from north to south, they were feeding on the chestnuts and roosting in the tops of the trees. So they were safe from predators up fairly high in the tree, and they had an excellent food source as they migrated. And when the chestnuts were killed, chestnut trees were killed, at least back to little root sprouts, and there were no more abundant, there was not an abundant production of nuts in the forest. The passenger pigeons suffered greatly, and between that and overhunting, they went extinct. Many creatures like chestnuts. If you have never seen a blue jay perform trying to catch a nut in midair, it's a really interesting sight. A chestnut grower whom I know in Connecticut used to make a collection of quite small nuts like American chestnuts, and he would stand on his balcony and throw them in the air, and the blue jays knew he was coming. They'd swoop down and grab them out of the air, fly off, put them on the ground, and hammer them into the ground to keep them, which is another great story about animals and chestnuts.
So one of the questions, or actually more of a comment, I've seen American chestnuts sprout at Walden Pond until the fungus kills them. Why aren't there more chestnut sprouts in the local woods?
Most of the ones I've seen around there are actually Europeans or European hybrids, but the main reason there aren't more sprouts is because there are deer. And the deer, as I said, are eating everything, oak trees, chestnut sprouts, many other species that are trying to survive in the forest. So the European chestnuts and European hybrids that are around here are being pretty well suppressed by the deer.
Okay. It sounds like you're fine with the GMO American Chestnut Initiative. Am I right that there are others who are opposing it? If so, do you know why?
I'm definitely in favor of it, and one of the reasons I think it's a good idea is that a lot of tests have been done now, and the product that this gene makes is present in a lot of foods. I remember that there's a lot of that in bananas, for instance, but the people in Syracuse have tested a number of foods and found that that compound to be present in fairly large amounts. And one of the reasons we're pretty sure it will work is because in, let's see, sometime in the 80s, 1980s, a colleague and I discovered that the killing strains of the fungus make a lot of oxalic acid. Now, that makes sense because oxalic acid would kill the cells around the wound where the fungus has landed, allowing the fungus to feed on the cell content. Oxalic acid would also capture the calcium that's binding the cells together, and that allows the fungus to grow between the cells and grow further on and make more oxalic acid, kill more cells, and grow to kill the cambium. The biocontrol strains that I imported in 1972, they work very well, by the way, in an orchard. They never really quite succeeded in a forest. But the biocontrol strains, which have a virus, make very little oxalic acid. So if the oxalic acid is the compound that's allowing the fungus to be a pathogen, then having a tree with a gene which makes a compound which kills, which destroys the oxalic acid, would give good resistance to the tree. And a lot of tests have been done now. The trees seem to be able to cross easily with others, and the genes are moved around as a single gene. And I think it would be very good to plant these trees. I don't see any drawbacks. It would give us a chance to have pure American chestnuts, timber trees, to add to the diversity of the forest.
Do you know the status of the FDA's review of the modified American chestnut that you have mentioned?
No, I wish I did. Every once in a while, I see Bill Powell someplace, who's the person in charge of that project. And nobody knows. We're waiting on the federal government. It could be years. It could be as soon as next year. But there's no way of predicting, unfortunately.
And when is a good time to graft trees?
Usually the grafting is best done after early spring because as you know, the sap is running in the trees in early spring. So if you make cuts early in the spring to do a graft, it'll bleed all over. So it's better to wait a little later, late spring. And since I'm a terrible grafter, I cannot recommend anything. I know that many of the nursery people who are producing cloned cultivars are producing them by grafting and have very good success.
So I have a few other questions. Are other species of chestnuts around the globe also threatened?
The European chestnuts really suffered very badly from chestnut blight as soon as it got there. Noticing that the trees were recovering. They looked terrible. They had big lumpy growths of callus all over them, but they're surviving. A Frenchman went out to these trees and took samples and brought them back to his lab and found that there was something wrong with the fungus. It was the same chestnut blight fungus, but it was sick. He didn't know what it was. He sent me samples. I got samples in 1972. We tested them in the laboratory and found very quickly that there was a virus in the sick fungus. And the virus keeps the fungus from killing trees. So this biocontrol has worked in the orchards of Europe fairly successfully. It's also been used in this country and orchards to keep orchard trees alive. It doesn't work so well in the forest where there's lots of competition. Chestnut blight infects all of the species of Castanea. It does very little damage to Japanese chestnuts, but some of the Chinese chestnuts can be killed by chestnut blight. There are the problem with the root rot is a much more serious one. There are resistant Asian trees, Japanese and Chinese, but most of the other species are quite susceptible. Now, we're lucky up here in the Northeast because that organism can't really survive the winters much north of New Jersey. But I have worried that as our climate changes and it gets a little warmer here, we may start having problems with Phytophthora root rot as well.
Hey, somebody made a comment here and a question. Roasted chestnuts were so popular as street food in New York City when I was a boy in the 1950s. So it sounds like these were European chestnuts. Any idea how this became so popular? Was it a continuation of an earlier popularity of the American chestnut?
Well, it was a continuation of the popularity of European chestnuts, which came in, as I said, in the late 1700s. I don't know why that became less popular. I think you can still find people roasting chestnuts on the street corners in New York City. Maybe the regulations about producing food and having licensing and things like that have been one of the factors. And certainly the people who import chestnuts are still importing large numbers. So the lack of the roasters in New York may be a question of regulation and not of people liking them.
Okay. I just have one other question, and I think another one just showed up. Was the practice of coppicing, and I may not have pronounced that right, on trees to produce wood products done with chestnut trees, and is it being done in restoration efforts?
I think coppicing is a great idea. And it would be fairly easy to grow chestnuts densely and cut them all down, let them sprout, and use the wood. One of the times when I was in England looking at chestnuts there, I visited a place where there are chestnut fence posts and fencing all connected together, made from coppice chestnut. It's a remarkable operation, and it has been going there. European chestnuts, of course. It's been going there for a long time. I don't know of anybody who's done coppicing and fence wood production here, but it certainly would be possible.
So I have a comment in a couple of comments actually, in the Richard Power novel, The Overstory. He describes how Thoreau, along with those from Georgia to Maine, would throw stones to drop the ripe nuts on particular Sundays and fill their pockets.
Yes. I'm not a fan of that book. That's just personal preference, but yeah, certainly people have harvested chestnuts many ways, and you can shake the trees and get the burrs to come down, or you can throw rocks at them and get them to come down. There are pictures of small children climbing up into trees and beating on the branches with sticks. Most of the harvesting methods these days are a little more sophisticated, and depending on where you are, that is, whether you're in the Northeast, the South, Southeast, or the Northwest, you have different requirements for the chestnuts you're going to harvest. Go ahead, Betty, tell us. We have 5 minutes.
I'm just, are you finished with that last comment, Dr. Sandy?
No, I'm not finished with that comment yet. So people in the Northwest want their chestnuts to fall intact in the burr so they don't dry out. In the Northeast and the Southeast, we prefer species and cultivars that open and drop the nuts free. So they're easy to harvest.
Okay, so one last comment, and I'm going to pass it over to Betty. Thanks, Sandy. You rock. Thanks to Waltham Land Trust for this cool program. And we're done on the question and answers.
Okay, great job, folks. I'm just going to quickly say, if people could note in the chat how they found out about this program, that would be really appreciated by the Land Trust. Just let us know. That would be terrific. Yeah, no more. Well,
if people have questions, look at my website. There's lots of stuff there, lots of pictures. And if you have a question you couldn't ask in this session, send me an email. I do check my email several times a day. And join the Land Trust.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Sandy. I really appreciate you sharing your vast knowledge with us. And definitely, I encourage folks to reach out to Dr. Sandy if you have questions. Check out her website. Yeah, if folks, I think a lot of people probably saw it on found out about our Zoom with the emails, but if you saw it in some other location specifically, that would be really helpful. And we're just so grateful to have Dr. Sandy in our midst. You know, she's an expert, guys, nationally, internationally, and she lives right here in Waltham. So that's very exciting. And I'll say too, please remember to check out walthamlandtrust.org. That's our website where you can find information about all of our cool programs or upcoming events. We put information up there as we determine it. And hopefully the duck walk will be announced sometime soon. The John Brewers, the John Brewers fundraiser is a week from tonight, and later on this month we have Bertucci's. So please do check out the Waltham Land Trust. And Hootie says, make a donation if you feel so inclined. Thank you.
Okay, with that, I think we're done, and thank you very much. We're just going to leave this open so that we can just double check. It's hard to record what comes through in the chat, but thank you so much for participating, and we'll see you another time.
And we will be putting this recorded video on our website. Once we determine where, I'll let you all know through our e-blasts.
Maybe we could put the link to Sandy's, that'll have it on Sandy's website and so forth, yeah.